So today we're going to talk about microbes, but specifically detail how and why they form biofilms and how biofilms protect them. All right, so there are some symptoms of potential biofilm contamination. First and foremost would be if you have a foodborne illness outbreak, or you have a series of defective batches and you can't seem to reason why else this occurred. Shelf life reduction, if you're having produce melt out on the way to a distributor, you very well could be experiencing a biofilm somewhere in your production system or on your farm. And that leads to the remainder of these product recall, off flavors or off notes. If there's a general smell in your production area that seems to change over time, or in your processing area, there's a good chance that you're dealing with some form of bacterial buildup, and it is likely in the form of a biofilm. So these biofilms are created by bacteria, and we're going to get into the specifics of this as we go throughout the presentation. But first, just having a general idea of where the contaminants are coming from will give you a much more encompassing view of where a biofilm could be. So here's a list of various foodborne illnesses and what type of markets they come from. If you'll look at notice the number of different foodborne illnesses, fresh produce typically has the highest, and it's very diverse. And many times in this section, this material is not cooked. We might clean it, but oftentimes we aren't using heat to degrade it like something we would do with a steak or cooking shrimp. A lot of times water is often involved as a vehicle for how these contaminants are spread around, as well as anything that deals with the rear end of a critter including us, enters into the fecal oral route. And basically what happens here is that you have some type of contamination that gets onto surfaces, gets into your water supply, moved around by your workers, your equipment, your bins, and that makes its way onto our produce and ultimately into a human that becomes sick, or an animal, and you repeat this process. So this is very commonly associated with foodborne illness, as well as just looking at a larger view of this, is that there are so many different locations where contaminants can come into the system. So the point being here is that bacteria want to form biofilms. Therefore, you could have biofilms virtually anywhere in your production system. So having this as an idea helps you understand what you need to clean and what you need to sanitize. So I like this slide because it shows, it's a little bit of an older slide, but it gets to the point here, is that half of our foodborne illnesses are caused by bacteria that want to form biofilms. And the other half, here it's norovirus, but the other half of the foodborne illnesses are protected by these biofilms. So biofilm formation, although caused by a bacteria, is very important to all of the foodborne illnesses we may experience in a production system. So where do we see biofilms? If you've ever looked inside of an irrigation system and seen this, that is a type of biofilm that is forming. It's got mineral deposits, bacterial colonies, algae, all kinds of material that are trapped in this protective matrix. If you don't take care of your teeth, or it's getting right about after dinner and you haven't brushed your teeth again and you notice a film on your teeth, that is a biofilm beginning to form. And that kind of points to how quickly biofilms can get initiated in the first place. Algae on the side of a fish tank is a form of biofilm, as well as the bacteria and photosynthetic algae that colonize the surface of stones in a river. If you've ever stepped on a slippery stone, that was because a biofilm had formed there. So the short answer here is that anywhere that you have some form of moisture and some form of nutrients, you can have a biofilm form. So what's a biofilm look like close up? So biofilm is broken into two broad components. First being the bacteria, and these are the little rod-shaped organisms here. Those are actually the bacteria that you're looking at. And then they have this protective matrix that is secreted from these bacteria. And we'll get into why this is so important as we progress through the talk. But just keep this in the back of your head that you've got bacteria that excrete a material, and then together they function as a biofilm. So there are two main phases of bacterial life cycles, or lifestyles rather. First, you have the planktonic phase. And this means that they're free swimming and they're floating around as single or very small aggregates of bacteria. Oftentimes, this is what gets into a water system that ultimately gets deposited somewhere and then forms a biofilm. When these free swimming bacteria land on a surface and begin to replicate, they adhere to that surface and they start producing this this protective matrix. And that's what you can see here with these little dots here. And what's happening here is that this is coating, this is turning these bacteria into basically a shield that protect all of the other bacteria that are inside of this. And so they're held together by this extracellular polymeric substance. And if you're reading about biofilms and food safety, you'll see this term come up, EPS. And that's what that's referring to, is this sugary connective material. So it allows for all of the organisms underneath this first layer to replicate in a very safe condition, safe and protected environment. But it also disallows other microbes that are trying to attack this bacteria, as well as many of our cleaning and sanitizing compounds to get down into the surface within this outer shield of the bacterial biofilm. So I like this cartoon. It represents very clearly why biofilms are a pain to deal with. Here they're trying to attack the biofilm, but it's got this outer shield and this outer covering. And if that is not disrupted, you cannot attack the biofilm. So it's a protective barrier. It helps the bacteria, viruses, fungi that get stuck inside of this matrix. It helps them from drying out or desiccating, as well as being attacked by other microbes in the natural system. Like I said before, it limits the penetration. And basically imagine this is your sanitizing solution and it's not going to work. Maybe you're going to kill this outside layer, but you're not going to affect all of these other microbes. And they also facilitate bacteria communication. So bacteria are considered single entities in the planktonic phase, but as soon as they start forming a biofilm, they start behaving like a single organism. And the catch here, though, is that they have the ability to fight back or to develop resistance to other to control compounds because they are in this constant communication with their neighbors in the biofilm. Additionally, when you have biofilms formed, yes, they stay in this shield for a while, but eventually they pop out of there and you can have rapid explosions of bacteria or other foodborne illnesses. So there's 5 stages, and we're going to go through this a couple times in various forms. So first, stage 1 is that there is a reversible attachment of the bacteria to a surface. This means that they've just landed on a surface, they're just getting their bearings, and they haven't set down adhesion type proteins to link into the physical structure of the surface that they've landed on, which happens in stage 2. Once they have linked into the topography of the surface that they're on, this is not, now you have to clean these off. You can't just use a sanitizer. In the third and fourth stage, they begin to accumulate and replicate and get bigger and bigger and suck in more bacteria. And they form these water channels in between them. And this facilitates the movement of moisture because they need moisture, as well as the movement of nutrients because they need nutrients like sugars to replicate, just like we need food. And then in the fifth stage, they've reached a holding capacity, and for one Q or another, they burst. And this is where you get that rapid explosion in the population. And then all of the free cells can start to process over and over and over. So we're going to go through that a little bit more completely here. So we have this initial stage, the bacteria just landed. It's reversible, and you can use a sanitizer. In the second stage, the biofilm is being initiated. The bacteria are starting to talk to each other, and they're excreting that protective coating. That's that yellowish looking material here. And you have to clean these before you can sanitize them at all of the stages past this first stage. During the next stage, they begin to replicate and start to take on some of the more physical characteristics of biofilms. The fourth stage, they're beginning to form these water channels. They're growing, they're replicating rapidly. And they also have the ability to allow viruses or other bacteria that get incorporated into this biofilm. And these could come in through the water channels. They could be attached to the sticky nature of the biofilm. But all of a sudden you have one bacteria causing a biofilm, and now you have three with potential potential foodborne illness pathogens present. And not only that, as it begins to mature, those, depending on what foodborne illness has gotten into the biofilm, they can replicate as well. So unfortunately, when you get into this dispersion phase, not only do you have the first bacteria you started with, but you could also have viruses and bacteria that are now re-entering your system and repeating this process. So for the dispersion stage, where do all of these planktonic, the free swimming bacteria go to? And pretty much anywhere that is accessed by water or moisture, and especially nutrients, is somewhere that biofilms can be initiated after this dispersion phase. So they can start a biofilm elsewhere and lead to these population, can lead to that population explosion. Oh, hey, just let me know if the slides are not changing. Something happened there.
Sure will.
Okay. So now that we know what biofilms are aggregates of bacteria that produce a matrix to protect themselves. Which microbes should we be concerned with that form these biofilms? And unfortunately, the answer is the vast majority of bacteria, especially those that cause foodborne illness, form biofilms. Some better than others, but what's important to note here, though, is that bacteria want to form biofilms. Some of the microbes that form the initial biofilm are not going to be dangerous in terms of food safety, but like we were saying earlier, how biofilms can trap in these other microbes, that is a source of concern, especially something like a yeast that can form this rapid explosion and trap in all of these other microbes. All right, so we're going to go through that process again, but we're going to take a look at how cleaning and sanitizing can affect the biofilms. So here we have our stages of biofilm development. And say we have a non-toxic bacteria that has entered into the system and has landed on a surface. and it's starting to form an initial biofilm. Once this initial biofilm is started, you could have something like a foodborne E. coli, foodborne illness E. coli, that enters into your system and locks into that primary phase of the biofilm. As the biofilm continues to mature, you're having replication of that first non-toxic bacteria, as well as replication of the toxic bacteria. And as this continues and continues, and the biofilm becomes more vertical and has more of these water channels. Additionally, as the biofilm continues to grow, it's bringing in all kinds of new bacteria. So it's just accumulating the bacterial colonies that are present in any part of your system, whether this is in a bin or your packing line. It's going to pull in the bacteria that are present. Additionally, with these water channels, we have a number of viruses that are important in food safety. And although the viruses may not replicate well within a biofilm, they sure can be trapped by it. Two that are particularly important in blueberry and foodborne illness in general are Nonvirus and Hepatitis A. So as you have this biofilm developing, you've got multiple different pathogens. You could have viruses that have a sink within this system that are surviving because they're not drying out and they're not being exposed to UV lights or any of the other external environmental factors. So we're going to take a little bit closer look at this, that when you have these mature biofilms, it's not just one pathogen, or it's not just one bacteria. You could have a whole suite of bacteria. And hopefully most of the bacteria present are non-toxic and non-foodborne illness related. However, you could have them in that system. And when they begin to let bacteria out of those mature biofilms, now you have all of the materials required to start a new biofilm somewhere else with potentially a greater replication rate for something like a foodborne illness like Listeria or E. coli. So this basically just leads to, if biofilms are let to mature, you have new problems, you have new biofilms starting in new locations, you have contamination of any of the water that is downstream of these biofilms, and it leads to health and food safety concerns. So biofilms have a number of monetary and production-oriented problems associated with them. So in reference to the talk, the reason for this meeting today is that the foodborne illness is possible due to what we were talking about before. Economic losses, you could have products recalled, you might have to trash a lot. Reduction in quality. Biofilm formation can lead to very slow accumulation of some of these contaminant element or contaminant bacteria that could lead to a reduction in your produce. Reduction in productivity. Bacterial resistance to disinfectants is important here. And we're going to talk about later how these biofilms help with that process. And then surface corrosion. Like we were talking about before, in that irreversible step, the bacteria actually link into the microscopic structure of your surfaces and they can destroy them, because nothing in reality is actually flat. It all has little fissures all over it. These bacteria can get down into it and rip it apart. Think of ivy growing up the side of a brick chimney and how it over time destroys it. The same thing can happen here, as well as continued application of corrosive materials to control these biocontrols. So all of these have monetary implications. So some conditions that help microbes are wet or damp conditions. If you can track the water, you can usually find the microbes. And that's the same principle that I talk a lot about when talking about plant diseases is that if find the water, find the pathogen. And that same instance is true when we're talking about biofilm formation. Not only do they enable the bacteria to grow, it also provides them with a mode of transportation to a new location. Temperature ranges between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit are considered the danger zone. And unfortunately, that's where most of life on this planet operates. Bacterial populations can double every 20 minutes. And if food storage is part of your processing system, the quicker you can get them into cold storage, the better off you're going to be because you're removing it from this critical temperature range. Inadequate cleaning. If you do not remove enough of the biofilm in the first place, your sanitizers are going to have very little effect at all of your different handling points. Excessive handling. If you're bruising your fruit and they're leaching out moisture and that's full of sugars and everything great about blueberries that we like, bacteria also like that. And we all know that sticky film that happens when moving blueberries. So that's the same thing with mechanical engineered fruit. The better you can treat your fruit, the less material you're going to have coming out, the less moisture, the better off you're going to be. So there are a number of different detection systems that can help you visualize biofilm formation. Here, this is a dye that is showing where biofilms are occurring. And what I'm taking from this image is that biofilms can get going just about anywhere. Anywhere there's moisture and nutrients, you can have a biofilm forming. And this could be in your bins that you're bringing in. This could be on various equipment. It's not just in your processing system. So visual moisture is something that's useful when observing biofilms. Biofilms make surfaces hydrophobic, and you might not be able to see a mat of bacterial growth, but you'll see water beating up in places where it would typically disperse onto the surface. Dyes, like we talked about prior. There are various optical methods where it's the interruption of light beams and the reflectance or absorbance of that light. And then there's this ATP bioluminescence test that basically uses cellular energy sources to detect if there is a biologically active microbe present on your surfaces. So going back to this slide, we need to break down this outer covering before we can have any hope of actually controlling these biofilms. So what is cleaning? Cleaning is when we manually disrupt or use mechanical or chemical, and in some cases biological control methods to remove these sections of the biofilm. We're knocking off this material so we can get to this material for sanitizing. And depending on what you're using, there are a number of different cleaners available for you. Detergents are good at moving carbohydrates, and in blueberries, that's a very sugar-rich environment, very much prone to the formation of biofilm. Detergents can help basically get these particles up off the surface and into the wash water and out of your system to clean your processing areas. So next is sanitizing. In order to sanitize, you need to clean the surface, because remember, this is what we were cleaning off. We were cleaning off these big chunks in the first place because this is the area that we could sanitize. For sanitation, there's chemical or physical agents such as heat that are able to destroy the microbes that are in this much smaller or much less dense population. And it reduces the biofilm forming cells to a safe level. There are a number of sanitizing agents that are available. Hydrogen peroxide has been reported, and materials containing it has been reported to be able to penetrate down into the biofilm itself if you missed any spots. So that's something worth considering as well. So we use these sanitizing elements to clean all of the surfaces. And I should have gotten that too, because it can attack that reversible primary phase to help clean your surfaces. So the idea being is that if you just go in with sanitizing material and you haven't properly cleaned the surfaces, you are going to have a sanitary surface, but the biofilm itself, if you're lucky, you're going to kill the very outermost layer of cells on that biofilm, in which case you still have this huge pool of potential foodborne bacteria or viruses. And so you still have this reservoir. So you need to clean first to remove this big chunk, and then go in with sanitizers to continue the sanitation process. So making sure that your water sources are clean or treated is really important, because if a biofilm lets bacteria off into this free swimming phase, they get into your water system and it's not clean or treated, any place that water touches back down into your system, whether that's out in the field or in your processing areas, you can have the formation of biofilms. So first you need to clean, then sanitize, and then using some method of testing, whether that's with a company that specializes this and not, you need to test your processing, your sorting, your handling, and any other areas where you are concerned that biofilms are coming in, to see if your cleaning and sanitation is working. Using the right labeled recommendations of your sanitizers and getting materials into cold storage as soon as possible is going to help you in this fight with dealing with biofilms. And then educating at a whole farm level to understand that cleaning is really important and it can't be skimped on. You have to clean before you sanitize. So if everyone knows what's going on, hopefully the better off the practices can be. So cleaning removes the big chunks, sanitizing removes the material that hasn't adhered to the surface yet. All right, and with that, I went a little quicker than anticipated, but thank you for your attention, and I can answer any questions.
Thanks, Tim. I feel the sudden need to go brush my teeth again. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so Liz, do you want to test? Oh, do we have a question? Or is that you, Liz?
Oh, that's me. Can you hear me now?
We can. All right.
Okay, good. I'm using my cell phone. It's a challenge today, so let me see what I can do. I'm going to share the screen. Do that one. There, you got that?
Yep.
Can everyone see it?
We're good.
Good. Okay. So the New Jersey Department of Agriculture has been actively promoting food safety by doing on-farm readiness reviews and educational inspections. We have a pretty good program. We have 7 inspectors with FDA credentials. We've gone in a number of OFRRs, on-farm readiness reviews and inspections. We use a standard checklist so that we're doing a uniform inspection. What we've done, we've kept all of the observations and discussions, not from on-farm readiness reviews, but from inspections. And we're keeping a tab on how things are going and what we need to look out for. So as we know, the FSMA Produce Safety Rule are the minimum science-based standards for the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce for human consumption. And the types of produce we're concerned with would be covered produce. These are normally consumed raw. For example, apples, lettuce, and tomatoes. The produce that is excluded is typically cooked, such as asparagus, eggplant, and potatoes. The reason this produce is excluded is because the cooking step is a kill step for various bacteria and germs that could be on the produce. So the ones that we're looking at are the RACs, the raw agricultural commodities. Now, if you're growing both covered and excluded produce, and you're not growing the excluded produce to the standards of the produce safety rule, then you'll have to segregate, clean, and sanitize in between those two commodities. Okay, a lot of people ask, and we've been going out to a lot of the larger farms who have third-party audits, and they want to know why they're subject to an inspection because they have an audit. Well, there is a difference. The third-party audits are voluntary. They're required by a produce buyer. They're usually 1 to 2 commodities and a packing house or a field, not the whole farm. And they have really high standards and a lot of records. The produce safety rule is quite different, actually. These are mandatory inspections by federal law for all covered farms growing covered produce. We're looking at the whole farm. And in comparison to the audits, these are the minimum standards and really a lot fewer records. So there is a difference. So we're looking at things that we're calling them inconsistencies. And these really are the things that we want to point out so that these are the main points that are being missed. So the PSA grower training is required, 1 person for every farm. In some cases, the training has not been completed, and really quite often the certificate is misplaced. So when you get that certificate in the mail, frame it, scan it on a computer, whatever you need to do to keep track of that. The produce safety rule states that there should be a supervisor assigned for every farm who's responsible for all the food safety. And we found issues with training personnel. In a lot of cases, the well trained. We had, the grandpa, the aunts and uncles helping. So anyone who's handling the covered produce needs some training. Seasonal workers arriving at different times often are not trained. They have the big push in the beginning, and then people who come in dribs and drabs aren't getting the training. A couple of the farms this year didn't train anyone at all, and said that COVID was the reason. Apparently Pastone wasn't available, but there still should be some training, even minimal on your part. You need to repeat the training if as necessary if you have an employee who is not following the rules, and document that training as needed. Okay. Hand washing is a big issue because, as you know, your hands are food contact surfaces, so they need to be clean. In some cases, hand washing was not being practiced before starting work, and the foreman would say, well, they just got here, their hands are clean. Well, we like to see them all line up and wash their hands before they start handling the produce. In a lot of cases, after breaks in the field, in field relocations, the people were not using the hand wash units. In some cases, there weren't any. All you can make your own hand washing unit. You need a jug and paper towels and soap and container for the water and the garbage. In a couple of cases, we had people working on packing lines who were handling their cell phones and then going back to packing, and that's not okay because, cell phones really are a hotbed for germs. As far as designated break areas go, majority of farms have them, but we saw several instances of people storing food and beverages in their produce coolers and people going in and out and helping themselves. So we really want to keep those in a separate area and enforce the hand washing after breaks. The hand jewelry policy, a lot of people have some idea about smooth rings and so on, but really couldn't clearly explain their policy or was necessary. But you need to cover watches and rings that are not cleanable. And it's really pretty basic, but make sure you have a policy and you articulate that to your workers. So the visitor policy is another interesting one. a lot of farms don't understand who the visitor is. They say, well, nobody comes onto my farm, but you know, that's not the case. You have people delivering fertilizer and seeds and picking up produce and inspectors and so on. And basically anyone can go on if you don't monitor that. So that's a visitor is anyone who really doesn't work for you, who comes onto the farm. The concept is to keep the produce safe from contamination and or adulteration. Some people had signs. The sign is great. We like that, but you need to have a policy too. The signage also helps, you know, direct people where to go to the office, and that they need to be aware of food safety. So a lot of farms have sign-in sheets, which are not required by the produce safety rule. But if you have a sign-in policy, then every visitor should sign in, including inspectors. We've gone on inspections and come and gone and not signed in or out. So if that's your policy, you have to enforce it. Okay, agricultural water is still not enforceable. The FDA is still working on water tests and so on. But we have had a lot of conversations about it, and these are some of the things you want to consider. You'll need to do an annual water system risk assessment. So you're basically walking the fields, and you're doing it anyway. You're setting up your water systems and making sure everything works. So just go ahead and document that. And make sure that you include all of your water sources, not just one well. That, you know, if you have 5 wells, have 5 wells on that risk assessment. And also include any major repairs, the well cap, you know, any big repair, not drip line or anything like that, but just the big repairs. Sanitizers and rates, we encountered a few people who weren't following the label, which, you know, is a big no-no, or monitoring the rates. It's important to monitor these rates to make sure it's working. And also to document that, just when you're monitoring it, make sure you write it down. That way we know what really happened. The FDA also is looking for certificates of compliance for municipal water, ice, if you buy it, and your hand wash water. That has to be potable or non-detectable generic E. coli, because you want to remember your hands are food contact surfaces. This is one a lot of people were not documenting. We talk about cleaning and sanitizing. Wait, I think I skipped a slide. Hold on. So food contact surfaces, let me back up. These need to be cleaned and sanitized. You have to remember it's a 4-step process. The first step, you're removing any obvious debris. The second type, applying a food grade detergent and scrubbing. The third, rinsing with water. And the fourth, applying a sanitizer and letting it dry. For all of your food contact surfaces. That includes your packing lines, of course, your harvest bins, your harvest knives, any food contact surfaces at all. You do have to keep records of this. And another issue we had was control of various items related to sanitizing. Harvest tools, particularly in blueberries, the bins, and harvest knives were being taken home. So if that happens when they come back, you do need to clean and sanitize them before you can use them. Okay, now this one. Now these equipment, tools, and buildings need to be cleaned as needed, okay, as needed to prevent contamination with microorganisms of public health significance. So you need to establish some kind of regular schedule for cleaning your vehicles, tractors, trailers, and whatever tools you're using in harvest, packing, and holding of produce, not the planting or anything before that, just the harvest, packing, and holding. So you want to make a list and get all your vehicles on there. In a couple of cases, we found people not using food-grade grease-on machinery, which you know you have to use, and several cases of discharged water, basically creating a flood situation outside the packing house. So you need to make sure the drainage is adequate, because you know that standing water can be a breeding ground for microorganisms. Okay, here's a big one for debate here, the drop produce rule. So there really are 2 instances of dropped produce. One would be drops, for instance, apples and peaches falling to the ground before they're harvested. And the other is produce that grows off the ground and has dropped to the ground, even if it's still attached to the plant, for example, tomatoes. There's a lot of debate going on. Presumably, there will have been some damage to the actual fruit by hitting the ground, which would allow an entry point for microorganisms. The FDA is still talking about this now. We also saw a few instances.
Liz, you're on mute.
It has been damaged.
You're just breaking up, Liz.
I'm sorry. Okay, so can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I'm using a cell phone in a building with no Wi-Fi, so it's a little rough. Okay, so the second instance on this slide is mishandled produce. That would be having been dropped on the floor and washed and sold. You have to realize that produce has been damaged. For instance, if you drop an apple and you look at it a week later, it's going to have a big bruise. So it also provides, a potential entry point for microorganisms. So mishandled produce really should be discarded. Okay, for toilet facilities, there is a law, a New Jersey State Seasonal Farm Labor Act, that says that toilet facilities need to be within 500 feet travel distance or a 5-minute walking time. And they also need to be separate for each sex. 1 to 20 males requires 1 seat. That would be 1 porta-john or 1 toilet seat. And the same 1 to 20 females get 1 seat too. In some instances, we found this wasn't being followed, or we also found porta-johns that really were overused. There were too many people. And if you have that many people, you either get more porta-johns or service them more often. And you also have to have a plan for a spilled porta-john or a plan for sewer leaks, and this would affect your covered produce. You can, if it were a porta-john, you could build a berm and have the company come and clean it up. A sewer leak, you'd call whoever, the plumber, but make sure that you're keeping that away from covered produce. Hand washing facilities, the Seasonal Farm Labor Act says that these need to be in the work area in the vicinity of the toilet facilities. In some cases, hand washing is not readily accessible or convenient enough that it's actually being used. There are a few instances of packing lines, packing houses where they had porta-johns, quite a ways, 100 yards off. And people would be less likely to go out there and use them if they're, for instance, use their cell phone. They wouldn't want to go all the way out there. So make sure they're convenient. In the field locations, a lot of times there were trucks without any hand washing facilities. On the right side of the slide is one you can make yourself. It's pretty easy. You need to make sure that there's hand soap because sanitizer is not a substitute for washing. Make sure the water tanks are filled up. You need single-use towels and receptacles for the wastewater and the hand towels. Well, most of the farms are outside, so we're obviously going to have some contamination from animals. So before you harvest any field or any particular crops, someone needs to go out and do a field assessment to identify and not to harvest that contaminated produce. In your food packing facilities and storage facilities, you need to have programs to control rodents, birds, and also in your storage areas to make sure your harvest bins and your food packing materials are safely stored. We had a few instances of pets actually in packing houses and in the fields. We like to see that pets are excluded from the equipment and the packing materials. Okay, well, records are always tricky. There's a publication by the Produce Safety Alliance, and I believe we give it out for every inspection. It shows you the records required by the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. The first one is the PSA Grower Training Certificate, so make sure you hang on to that. You have worker training records, that's annually and for all the employees that you have, including family members. You need a record for cleaning and sanitizing food contact surfaces, for cleaning buildings, vehicles, and tools. And you'll need your water system risk assessment and your certificates. Coming later will be biological soil amendments and water testing. This was interesting that the majority of the farms, and especially the ones with audits, had great records, at least some records, but they were missing the name and the location of the farm and the date and time the activity was performed. So the PSR record format is a little tricky, but if you look at that document I just referenced, it'll tell you how to create your records. For all of these, you need to keep the records for at least 2 years after they were created. For qualified exempt, we'll talk about, it's actually 3, that's coming up. You can use your existing records. You don't need to create anything new, but make sure that you include this format, the name and location of the farm and the date and time performed. Okay, our inspection timeline is started in 2019. The farms, it's based on income, a 3-year average adjusted for inflation. So we're up to 2021. So now we're looking at all farms, including any farm that has over $25,000 of produce sales. The qualified exemption, a lot of farms in New Jersey qualify for this. It's less than $500,000 annual income from total food sales, not just produce. That's food for humans, food for animals, and animals sold for food. And also more than 50% retail. When we do the record checks, we're looking for 2 things. We're looking for Schedule F from the income tax for the past 3 years and a current year's evaluation and receipts showing that your sales are more than 50% retail. Other exemptions, farms that have less than $25,000 in income are just hobby farms. They're exempt from the rules, but we hope they're still following the good agricultural practices. The process exemption is for farms that are growing vegetables that are going to processing, and it only applies to those vegetables that are being processed. So if you grow tomatoes and they're processed and you have other vegetables, you would still be covered by the rule. Okay, so we have a New Jersey State Farm inventory, and I'm responsible for keeping that. It helps us to organize our funds and our inspections. So we will contact you if we haven't already. We're going to ask some questions, the number of acres and employees, what are you growing, your income range, your PSA training, your audit history, and that kind of thing. But you should know information will remain confidential, so don't be afraid to share that with us. And lastly, we have a new produce safety website, and on this we have information about the produce safety rules, FSMA, grower training, on-farm readiness reviews, inspections. We will have a checklist coming up soon on everything we look at when we're doing an inspection. There's a lot of good information there. So please. Questions?
Does it look like we've got everybody? We wanted today to just take an opportunity to get you updated on a few things before the season gets started. And so the first thing that we wanted to make sure that we covered is the New Jersey vaccination program for the agricultural community. Migrant farm workers became eligible to get vaccinated on the 15th of this month, and the rest of the ag community becomes available for vaccination on the 29th. Wes participates in weekly calls with the Department of Ag, Department of Health, and Department of Labor. And so this has been really great at getting information from these agencies that's critical for the ag community out to everyone. And so what the latest information that's come out from the Department of Ag and the Department of Health is this survey that that if you haven't received an email with this link already, you will be receiving this link. And the purpose of this survey is to find out what farms are interested in having their workers vaccinated for COVID. And so this is the Johnson & Johnson single dose vaccine that's going to be offered through the federally qualified health centers that we have in the state. And so anyone on a farm who's 18 years or older is eligible for the single dose vaccine through these federally qualified health centers. So that's workers at the farm and family members who are also at the farm. You can copy this survey from here. Maybe Jen can put that in the chat box, but you'll also get information I think along with a letter from Doug Fisher specific to the survey. So the survey is just gathering information about your operation and the number of workers that would be eligible for the vaccine. Also with this information is sort of a little Q&A, and the nitty gritty of that is that even if your entire workforce has been vaccinated, you still have to follow the state masking mandates. So the masks are required for your workforce when they're in that close proximity to each other, and there are additional details that'll go out in that email. You can require that your workers get the vaccine before returning to work, but that you cannot require it for people that have a disability, are pregnant, breastfeeding, have religious beliefs that would impact their ability to get the vaccine, or because they've been advised by their doctor to not get the vaccine. And workers can use paid sick leave to get the vaccine. So in terms of general COVID updates for this season, the executive orders that were in place that impacted farms and direct farm market locations last year are still in effect. So all of the messaging that you received from us last year, at this moment, that still all applies for the 2021 season. So that's the social distancing requirements, face covering requirements, surface sanitation and disinfection requirements, having hand sanitizer available, and then again, right, with the vaccines when they're available. And so it's important to know that the most immediate information, once we have it, Wes has been posting all of that on the Plant and Pest Advisory. So if you're not signed up for that, I'll have the link later on that you can sign up, or you could just Google Rutgers Plant and Pest Advisory and plug in your email address to get the updates. So you can see Wes posted this COVID update from Secretary Fisher on the Plant and Pest Advisory. We did too want to cover the difference between disinfection and sanitation, right? So with all the food safety trainings you've been through in the past, we've talked about sanitation, but with COVID, this really became the first time that we were talking about disinfection. And the CDC recommendation for disinfection is using bleach, although you can use other products. You just have to make sure you're following the label instructions for disinfection. But for bleach, it's 1/3 cup of bleach to 1 gallon of water. So that's a much higher ppm rate than you would normally use for sanitation on surfaces. And again, this is specific to surfaces, these food contact surfaces, these high touch surfaces, not on produce itself. So this is about 1,000 parts per million. So you like probably about 10 times, maybe more than what you're used to using. So it's important that protective equipment is being used. So gloves for hands, and then certainly proper air ventilation in the space where the disinfectant is being used. And then the label of the product, again, is really important. It's going to tell you how long the surface needs to stay wet, and if it needs to dry after that wet period, or if you need a clean water rinse afterwards. We also see, particularly in direct market locations, the disinfectant wipes being used. And again, it's important to read the instructions. The 3 products that you see here all had a 3 or 4 minute wet time after use. Cleaning that surface of debris is really important. So it's the same as we talk about with sanitation. You need to clean that surface and remove all that organic material from the surface before you come in with the sanitizer. And it's the same for disinfectants. So when I was testing out these wipes, I found that I had to use more than one wipe in order for the surface to stay wet for that 3 to 4 minute time period. And so if you're using these in an environment where you've got wind or where you've got fans blowing, particularly in the summer months, right, that surface is going to dry more quickly and it's going to impact the efficacy of these wipes working on the surface. So just pay attention to that label and make sure the people who are actually using these wipes are following those instructions. So we do have a few more workshops coming up this season. Well, a couple, I should say, too. March 19th, Wes will be presenting on backflow prevention and your farm. So you're going to be hearing this today. Wes is going to be talking about this. Oops. But if you've got other people that want to hear or that should be hearing this presentation, that'll be March 19th from 12 to 1. You can sign up online. It's free. It will be recorded, so it'll be available after the fact also. And then on March 26th, I'll be focusing on best practices for record keeping. And then our next FSMA workshop won't be until September 15th, but we do have registration available online. So if you go on our on-farm food safety website, you see the addresses up here. If you haven't been on the site before, you could go to this current trainings tab on the left-hand side and click on trainings in New Jersey, and that will take you to our Eventbrite page where you can register for the trainings that we have coming up. Also on our webpage are a lot of the resources that we talk about when we come out and do farm visits, resources that we talk about when we've done on-farm readiness reviews and mock audits. And so we encourage you, we have third-party audit specific information together under this tab. We've got information on developing recall plans, general resources, and then a link to the plant and pest advisory also. Wes had mentioned on-farm readiness reviews in the intro, and so this is something that we're still offering in the state. So an on-farm readiness review is a voluntary assessment of farm practices to evaluate how ready is the operation for a Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rule inspection. So they're voluntary. You have to sign up for one. I know a number of you have had them already, and hopefully you had a good experience with that and found it useful. But it's also free and it's confidential. So it's a nice way to get an idea of how your operation is going to get through the inspection process. We've conducted over 80 of these in New Jersey. We're still offering them going forward. So as long as somebody wants to have a readiness review, they'll be offered, and this is a collaborative effort between the Rutgers Food Safety team and the Department of Agriculture. You do need to contact Charlotte Mutter at Department of Ag in order to schedule a readiness review, and her email address is there. It's also on the front page of our food safety website and available on the Department of Ag website. And so when we look at the farms in New Jersey, the first question is which types of farms asked to have a readiness review conducted. So about 5% of the farms that we did reviews at are currently exempt from the rule. And so in this case, they were people that just wanted to know about food safety in their farm, even though they wouldn't have an inspection, and others were farms that were looking to size up and anticipated that the rule would impact them in the future. 55% of the farms sold more than $500,000 worth of produce annually. 18% sold between $250,000 and $500,000 annually, and 22% sold between $25,000 and $250,000. So, you know, we've got lots of representation going on different sizes of operations. And what we found we were talking the most about in terms of needs of improvement was improved worker health and hygiene. So as Liz had mentioned, hand washing facilities in closer proximity to where workers are working, but also the same for toilets, annual training for workers. And so we saw this a lot on farms that did not have to comply with a third-party audit. So food safety training would be something new for their workers. And then inadequate visitor notifications. So for the people that are coming on to the farms, how are they going to know what the health and hygiene policies are specifically? Where do they use the bathroom? Where do they wash their hands, and when would that happen? We also spent some time talking about post-harvest sanitation with pest control programs, better record keeping, and then construction and maintenance of buildings, more about keeping animals out of those spaces. And then also pre-harvest water. So farms, again, that weren't having to comply with audits in the past, maybe hadn't sampled their water source, their irrigation water source, and that lack of an annual water system inspection. But overall, we saw lots of great practices happening on farms too. And we were happy that most farms that needed to make changes in order to get into compliance with the rule just needed minor changes. And often cases, the farmers knew this was an issue and they had plans in place to make those changes. So here's the Plant Pest Advisory link if you're not signed up to receive these updates. We've got the food safety tab here, but we've got commercial ag updates, and you get to choose which updates that you receive when you sign up for that. And so that's it for me. Any questions about the upcoming trainings?
Talk about backflow prevention. This came up last year, and we actually had a couple presentations planned when we had to cancel the in-person training. And it's come up because it is in the PSR, the produce safety rule. And some of these slides I'm going to show you, I know are not blueberries, but I'm going to try to orient how it relates to blueberries. And Tim did an excellent job this morning talking about biofilms, which is a huge issue. And it doesn't matter whether you have the cleanest blueberry line or not, there is possibility of biofilm. So what you don't want is your water that may be contaminated now going back into your water source. And that's why we're going to be talking about backflow prevention. All right, so we're going to talk about prevention. We're going to talk about how it relates to the PSR because it is in the produce safety rule. Talk about some of the different parts and some examples. Talk about prevention, what it is, how you prevent it, and some examples from farms. So when we talk about fluid mechanics, I mean, it's very simple. Water flows downhill, or at least it goes to the least resistance. It may go sideways, depending on where the least resistance is. Also, it goes from high flow to high pressure to low pressure issues. And that's why we use pumps, because it creates pressure to move the water to where we want it. And depending on what your pipe or tubing is, there may be issues of compatibility and how a backflow device works properly. And of course, valves turn water on and off, but it does, other than manually doing it, it does not prevent water flowing back into a source. So backflow obviously is water traveling where we don't want it. It's going in the wrong direction. It's going into something we don't want it to go into. And the steps we take for backflow prevention is how to make sure that water goes in the direction we want and not the opposite, which should help reduce cross-contamination and cross-connection of water supplies. I did forget to say at the beginning that this almost all this presentation really comes from the University of Vermont. They have an excellent engineer there that works with Extension, and he developed, Chris Callahan developed this materials, and he's a very good resource for us. And I will have his website and contact information at the end of this presentation. So under the PSR, it's very clearly states the intentional and directional reliability of water flow is important for ensuring agricultural water is safe and of adequate sanitary quality. And it's mentioned at least 3 times in the PSR. And we're going to go into each one of these in a little bit more detail. Again, 112.41, which is the section of the rule. What requirements apply to the quality of water? Again, all agricultural water must be safe, of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use. That does not mean there aren't differences in the water. It's what it's used for. For instance, irrigation water. You can have generic E. coli in your irrigation water as long as it's right now under 126 colony form units for 100 mils of water. And that's why you're getting your water test to see if it meets that. If it's a well situation, chances are you're not going to have any E. coli at all. If you do, you have a problem with your well. But surface water is where the issue begins, because you can easily have over 126 CFUs, depending on the time of the year, the water source, and what is happening up above you. In a packing operation, it's different in the sense that in that case, the water must have non-detectable generic E. coli. Again, that's why you're getting a water test. That's why it very clearly states that in a packing operation, you should be using well water, municipal water. You cannot use surface untreated water in a packing operation. Realize you're not using water on blueberries, but you are using water to clean that equipment down and that packing line down. That's where the non-detectable generic E. coli comes in. Excuse me. The second part, 112.42, what requirements apply to my agricultural water source, water distribution, pooling of water. And there's really 4 different parts to this. You must inspect your water supply system. As Liz said earlier, the water section under the rule is still on review. We hope that sometime this year, they will come out with a final ruling. We had hoped it would be out last September. Our understanding it's in the Office of Management and Budget for review. So we hope it will come out sometime this year. When it does come out, we will let everyone know what the changes are, because they could be substantial changes in the number of samples you need to take, and other issues related to water use in the field and also in a packing operation. So A5, the likelihood of introduction of known or reasonably feasible hazards in water systems from someone above you. And this really relates to, before the water reaches your farm. This really relates to, again, surface water. If you're pulling water from a stream or a river, what happens above you? I mean, was there heavy rain? You got a lot of influx into that water source. Or if you have a pond, but you're really recharging that pond from a stream, that's where the issues can be. You cannot necessarily control what happens above you because it's someone else's property, but being reasonably aware of what's happening and the potential of that hazard. That's what it's referring to. See, B, you must adequately maintain a water distribution system to prevent the water distribution system being a source of contamination. And this includes on your food contact surfaces. So that's where the annual inspection comes in under the rule. Knowing what your sources are, knowing where the water is going, knowing potential sources of where that water could be contaminated. Also, C, not having any cross connection. This is not much of a problem in the east. It definitely is a problem out west, where they will use the same underground mains to move effluent from a slurry store or a feedlot, and then turn around and use it, same thing for irrigation. So that is a concern in out west. And the last one there, implement measures reasonably necessary to reduce potential contamination as a result of contact covered produce with pooled water. And in this case, we're talking about, again, irrigation. You have pipe laying above the ground, you have a deadhead, and the water drains out of your irrigation, your above ground main. When you shut the system down, you end up with a pool of water, gets above where your intake is for that pipe. And then when you turn, and that water can go back into the system since there's no pressure there. And then you're contaminating the water when you start up your pump again. So those are the type of things to think about. You do need to do the annual inspection, as I said, when it goes into effect. And you'll have to have the water testing, of course. 112.133, and this is where the backflow comes into the equation. What requirements apply to plumbing? The plumbing must be of adequate size and design and be adequately installed and maintained. For the distribution system, maintaining having enough pressure, making sure that sewage or liquid disposable waste does not contaminate the source, and any ways you can avoid contamination on your food contact surfaces. Again, this is where backflow devices come in, so you're not recontaminating something. So the first thing to do, and we've talked about this in all of our food safety training, whether it's for an audit or for Produce Safety Alliance, is first thing you need to do is know where your water system is. Mapping the system. You can see on the right side of your screen here an overall map. This was a Google map. You can use FSMA maps. You can hand draw it. The biggest thing, knowing where your water intakes are, knowing if you have a separate pumping station, where your underground main goes, where your main risers are, and any connection you have with your packing operation, or even in this case, they have a house and they have it marked. This may be a problem for older operations, especially if someone purchases the operation and there's no drawings whatsoever of what they are, but you do the best job you can to know where these different things are. And as Tim said earlier, he was pointing out biofilms and inside that irrigation pipe. We have done some work with older underground pipe, and it took us 2 weeks to get rid of all the goop or biofilms that was inside that pipe. We were flushing it with chlorine, and it took us 2 weeks before we could measure chlorine levels at the end of a drip line, just because that main had been in the ground for so long, and it really built up biofilms. And this can be a concern, not for drip irrigation, but any overhead irrigation you're doing. It obviously slows down the flow of water, and you may have to increase your pressure because of it. So after you do figure out where everything is, looking at your water sources, for instance, in this case, a well, is it sloped properly away from the casing? Do you have a good cap on it that nothing could fall down inside it? And then also, is there a backflow prevention device on the well, whether it's in the well or outside of the well? I have talked to well drillers. I've talked to people who install irrigation, and this seems to be an ongoing question, how they're inspected, the backflow devices, and how do you maintain them? Here's an example of the one on the right, obviously is for in a building. The one on the left is an irrigation line, which has the test cocks on them. You need to be talking to your person who's handling your irrigation or sold your irrigation parts on how you test these, because there's very few people who seem to understand that these need to be tested periodically and how it's done. Disposable water, whether you're out in the field, and Liz already showed you this picture, maintaining the water, making sure the water that, for instance, it goes in that bucket. If this is something simple like this you're doing, then where do you dispose of it? That's always come up in trainings. As long as you're doing it, you can put it in a fence row. You can, on places where it's not going to contaminate the harvestable part of the crop, or someone's going to walk or drive through. That's what you have to think about. If you have a porta-john and a wash station, say on a trailer, you know, do you pipe that into the porta-john? And some people do it that way. But you have to think about how you're going to dispose of this water, that you're not going to end up contaminating something. Or in your packing shed, where does that water go once it leaves the packing shed? Does it go underground into a septic system? Does it go into, shall we say, something like a French drain, an area where it can drain into the ground? What you want to make sure is that it does not come to the surface, and again, you're walking or driving through it. And I've been in operations that are blueberry operations where that does occur. So let's talk a little bit about the parts and the systems of backflow. You're looking to preventing the water, again, backing up, obviously. You want it to go in one direction, whether it's from check valves, which we'll talk about in a minute, or air gaps that can be used in some situations. So there are two main types of check valves. You have the swing type, which is gravity force opens the gate, and then the pressure on the other side closes it. You have the spring type, where it's not gravity, it's actually a spring by the name, and that keeps the water pressure on one side higher than the other. So these are the two main types of check valves there are. And I'm going to show you examples of those and some of the issues related to them. So we're looking at three types. We're looking at a spring ball type. On top there, you can see all three of those, they're closed. So the water pressure is on one side and not on the other. Then you have the spring disc type. Again, you can see the examples there, and the top is closed and the bottom is open, where the water pressure pushes against it and comes open. Or you have the gate type, again, where the gate flows open because of the water pressing against it. Here's some examples of those spring ball types. Again, these are smaller versions, obviously, for drip irrigation or in a packing house. You have the swing gate type again, and then also the spring disc type. And I'm going to show you the swing gate type in a minute and some of the issues with those. You also have a foot valve for a water source, and I'm going to show you that in a second also. So this is a 3-inch spring type. This one is well marked. It tells you which way it has to go, because there's there's a up and down side to these. Also, all of these are marked which way the water flows. And obviously you don't want to install them backwards. You'll see on the right there, you can see the hinge is in that dotted area, the red dotted area, and the gate. So that's what swings up when the water flows through it. So here's an example of that swing check. On the picture on the left is closed, and as the water pushes against it in the center, you can see that it opens up. If you install it the wrong way, in other words, upside down, you'll see on the right, that gate always stays open. So it serves no purpose at all. It doesn't work. So you have to make sure when you have this type of check valve, make sure you install it right side up. Foot valves are mainly for on lines to maintain pressure. So for priming, again, you notice in the center, you can see that it shows which way it has to be installed. You have a screen on the bottom, which can be taken off and cleaned, but this maintains the pressure in the line, for instance, in a well. And that way, when you turn the pump on, you get a little bit of water in, it opens up, and you maintain your prime. If you didn't have this, it would not maintain the prime. And you can see on the right there where it's closed on the top one, and the left, they pushed your finger in and where it opens up. So there are 5 key points for check valves. What are you going to use them for? How much flow do you need? What's the size of the demand? Making sure they're working properly for the demand you have. Making sure you identify where they should be put in and adding those check valves. Know the type, the swing or the spring. There is a YouTube that you can watch, which explains the differences between the two. But really the biggest thing is which one is better for use, whether it's the swing or the spring type. The advantage of the spring type is you can install them upside down or sideways. And it doesn't make any difference because it's the spring that maintains the pressure. With the swing type, again, you have to install them the right way, or if not, they will be open all the time. Material compatibility, for the most part, it's not an issue. If you're using a concentrate, such as PAA, which is acetic acid, pyruvic acetic acid, or chlorine, generally it's not a problem. And most of you guys aren't maintaining this in a line anyway. You're spraying it on the equipment to clean it off. If you're getting high levels because of you are running a lot of concentrate, then you have to make sure that it's not going to corrode what you're doing. And brass can be an issue related to releasing lead, for instance. So you do have to make sure you check that. But for the most part, this is a non-issue with us. Again, orientation, I've already talked about this a couple of times, making sure that you are installing them correctly. If not, you're just wasting your money. And the size, you can size it fairly easy with the size of your pipe you have. If there is an issue because of low flow, low pressure, then you may have to upsize the check valve just because of it. But generally, that's, again, is not an issue for us. This is an example of one check valve that was ordered. And this one, I guess, was from Granger. It will say on most of these, if you're getting the reputable source, where it can be used, because some of these cannot be used on potable water systems. So you do need to check to make sure it can be used for the purpose that you're going to use it for, because there can be some issues related to chemical contamination in some cases. Now I want to talk just a little bit about air gaps, and this relates into a packing operation, especially if you have everything interconnected in your pipes. You have, in this case, a pesticide clean out drain just outside the packing operation. You have a toilet drain inside the packing operation, and you have sinks where you're washing produce. Again, I know this is not a blueberry example, but just to point out a couple of things. So they're all flowing out into the main pipe. So what happens if you get a clog? Obviously, it's going to start backing up. So it's going to go to the least resistance. It's backing up towards the toilets, and there's less pressure coming from the drains from the sink. So in this case, it continues to back up. If you have an air break or an air gap, this is what happens. It may go out on the floor. A mess, yes. Smelly, probably. May have to be concerned because of the pesticides that may be mixed into it, but it can be cleaned up. However, if you don't have that, and everything can go right up into the drains and into the sinks. So in this case, it's much better to have an air gap. And I'm going to show you a picture of what it looks like. This is an air gap on a sink, where you can see on your left there the space between where the water will come out and where it goes into the drain. So if there is backup, it's going to overflow onto the floor and back down into the drain. It's not going to be pushed up into those sinks. And that would be a concern for anyone who's doing any type of washing of produce. It also could be a concern if you're doing something where you're, for instance, filling a tank or something to clean, or using these to have water so you can clean your packing line. The other issue can be floor drains. I've had questions about, well, should we have floor drains? And the answer is yes. You want to keep your floors as dry as possible. One of the issues that have come up in some foodborne outbreaks has been water standing on floors. And someone coming in, bringing in this case, it was the melon outbreak in 2011, where a worker may have brought in on their shoes Listeria. That Listeria then ended up on the packing equipment and contaminated melons, and 33 people died. So we want to keep the floors as dry as possible, but you also have to have drains that drain. You'll notice on the lower left here, this one's backed up, shall we say, and they're trying to unplug it with a hose. Well, you unplug it, and what are you going to do with that hose? You got a contaminated hose, which probably is just going to get hung up where the faucet is instead of cleaning. So you got to make sure that those floor drains are cleaned and sanitized on a regular basis, and making sure your outflow from the drain is unplugged and again can be cleaned. One of the issues we have with drains is Listeria. There have been situations, I know of operations, where they've had to go in and completely redo their drainage system in the floor because of Listeria. Once you have Listeria in that drain, it's next to impossible to get rid of it. So the best thing to do is have a normal or regular cleaning process during the season when you're running your packing operation, making sure you clean and sanitize those. And they really should be looked at weekly, and maybe more often if you're running long periods of time. This is definitely what we don't want. This is a floor drain. Obviously, it's old concrete. It's broken up. Great place to harbor pathogens. So doing as best you can to make sure that one, water drains toward the drains and that they're cleaned. I know someone who just put in a recent packing floor, and the person doing the cement ended up having lips around. So he's getting poor drainage from a brand new floor that he just put in. So if you're going to redo a floor, make sure it drains toward the drains. Now, this is not a good example for blueberries, but in this case, they're using, excuse me, blue lay flat there to put water into their tank where they're doing leafy greens. Well, the problem is they have it sticking down in the tank. And that's a great way to contaminate the water source. If they had an air break, they just cut it shorter, then they would be fine. This is true for pesticide store or sheds also. You can use air breaks when you're filling water tanks. What I've seen is someone taking a hose, sticking it down in the tank, turning it on, filling the tank, putting pesticide in while water's running, then taking that hose out after it's been sitting in there and putting aside. Not thinking about it, they've just contaminated that hose with a pesticide. And if there's not a backflow device on the water source, pulling some of that in, potentially pulling some of that into their water source. So backflow prevention, where do you use them? Well, on any water supply. Check valves on supply system for individual buildings, any significant place where there is a risk, especially if there's chemicals involved. Also, a foot valve on the irrigation source, which should have been put in by your well driller. And you can use air gaps. In your case, would be for pesticides, probably would be the place. As far as drains, consider dedicated drains for different risks, and which probably doesn't happen in most cases, and that's understandable. But making sure there isn't any cross connections where things can be drawn back into your water source. And thinking about what happens if you have a spill. What do you do? How do you clean it up? Where are your supplies? Where's your standard operating procedure for what someone does when you're not there? but someone is trained to know what they need to do immediately. And checking and making sure backflow prevention is working, and checking with your, again, with irrigation, checking with your irrigation supplier on how you do check those. This is different resources from Chris. As I said, Chris Callahan is one of the few ag engineers we have left in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, and is a very good source for a lot of different information. His website has many different fact sheets and also a lot of YouTube presentations on there that are worthwhile looking at. Are there any questions? Again, this is what Meredith showed you earlier. Our website, we have lots of information. We continually update it. There's a whole section on COVID from last year, and we're continually adding to that. Again, I'm going to be doing this same presentation on Friday from at 12. For anyone who hasn't heard it, Meredith will be talking about on-farm record keeping for food safety on the 26th. And our next PSA training is September 15th and 16th. Are there any questions?